Today we celebrate the first Sunday of Lent. We begin the sacred season of Lent. And therefore, as we are in the beginning of this, it is almost fitting that we find ourselves in the first reading, in the beginning. We find ourselves in the beginning of Genesis, the end of chapter 2. But if we back up just a little bit to the beginning of Genesis, when God is creating, we see that when God creates, it is what? God creates and he declares it to be good. Precisely. And then after God creates the universe, he creates Adam. And then the next person to speak in the Bible, pretty much at the end of page 1, is Adam. And what does Adam say? Eve is created from his rib, and he says, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. They're in the garden at this point. You have Adam and Eve. What do you think the garden represents? The garden is a source of life. And not just a few sentences after Adam speaks, we get the third person to speak in Genesis. Who's the third person to speak? Satan, the serpent. Eve is created and doesn't even get a chance to get a word in. And what does the serpent tell Eve? He tells her that if you eat from that tree, mind you, it's important that it's a tree. If you eat from that tree, you will become like who? God. You will become like God. Now, Eve has only been around for a few sentences at this point, and obviously she thinks very highly of herself, because when she gets told that she could become like God, well, she takes him up on that offer. She wants to be like God. And so the first sin really is pride, because she thought she could become like God. And so she goes up to the tree and pulls a piece of fruit from it and eats it. And from that point comes sin into the world and the fall of our human nature. But it's important that it happens from a tree, because a tree is a sign of life. It blooms, it blossoms, it gives forth fruit. But this one was not good. In about 36 days, I think, we will find ourselves celebrating another tree. What day will we be at? Good Friday. And on Good Friday, we see another tree. We see the cross made from wood. And from this tree is different. If from the tree in the Garden of Eden, evil came forth into this world, sin came forth into this world, it is through the tree that we see on Good Friday, the cross, that sin is conquered. Sin is forgiven by the cross. And so the cross is incredibly important. But yet, we don't always like the cross. Why? Because it's burdensome. It's heavy. And it almost scares us. Why? Because it makes us uncomfortable. But the cross is going to come, and we're going to have to carry it. In the gospel this morning, we find ourselves in the beginning of our Lord's public ministry. And before he goes out and he starts to present himself to everybody, he goes into the desert. Notice that in Genesis, we go into the garden, which is a sign of life. Jesus goes into the desert. What do you think the desert represents? Death. He goes into the desert, and he encounters Satan. Because you see, Satan's fairly smart. He knows what Jesus is up to. And he knows that Jesus is trying to come to save the world. Obviously, he does not want that. And so Satan is trying to give Jesus 3 shortcuts away from the cross. Satan is thinking to himself, well, I've already won the world. And I can teach him how to win the world. He won't have to suffer. He won't have to die. He won't have to talk about forgiveness or reconciliation. But I can teach him how to win the world without having to suffer. And so, Satan begins to tempt the Lord. He tells him, you've been in the desert for 40 days, haven't you? Surely you're hungry. Look at those stones. They look like bread. Turn them into bread. All people want is to have their gullets filled. If you want to win people over, and if you want to have control over them, appeal to their instincts. We have a food instinct, we have a money instinct, and we have a sex instinct. And if you appeal to people's instincts, you will have a certain power over them. And you can win over the world, and you won't have to suffer, and you won't have to die. And you can win the world. And what does Jesus say in response? One does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. And so that first temptation to win over the world was an appeal to our instincts. Because if somebody manipulates our instincts, they have the ability to control us. The next temptation, one of entertainment and amusement. Satan goes up to Jesus and says, go to the parapet of the temple, meaning go to the top of the steeple of the temple and throw yourself down and allow the legions of angels to come catch you. All people want to see is a great trick. People want to be amused. They want to be entertained. They want to be astounded. People want to be stimulated. They want to be titillated. And if you do that, you can win a certain control over them. People want to see marvels. They want to be astounded. And if you do that, you can have a certain power over people. Because they are attracted to marvels. They constantly want to be stimulated. We need 24-hour news on the hour. We need to conquer gravity. We need to send a man to the moon. And if you do so, you can amaze people, and people will follow you because they are attracted to marvels. People just want to be entertained. And what does our Lord say to Satan? You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. And then Satan moves on to his final temptation. One of politics and power. And he goes up to Jesus and he says, all of these kingdoms are mine, and I will give them to you if you bow down and adore me. I ask of you, to what extent and in what ways was Satan lying? And so he tempts Jesus with all the power in the world, because Satan knows that people follow people who have power and prestige. If you want to win over the world, get out into it. Get overly involved in the political process. Shout and scream and people will follow you. If you make yourself look important and that you have power and prestige, well, guess what? People will follow you. Because we live in a world that is mainly filled with more followers than with leaders. And if you want to win people over, get out into the world. Become like the world. And you will have a certain dominion over people. And you will not have to suffer. You will not have to die. You won't have to talk about forgiveness. You won't have to talk about contrition. You won't have to talk about suffering. You can be able to win the world without any of that. And what does our Lord say in response? Get away, Satan. Our Lord calls him Satan. Now, he's often referred to by different names. There's obviously the serpent. He's referred to as the devil. But there's a special meaning behind the word Satan. Spiritually, what is the essence of the satanic? It's hatred of the cross. It's hatred of suffering. It's looking at the cross and saying, I'll have none of that. That is the essence of the satanic, spiritually. Psychologically, do y'all know what the essence of the satanic is? Confusion, discord, disunity. That is how the satanic manifests itself psychologically. But spiritually, it's looking at the cross and saying, I'll have none of that. That is the essence of the satanic. And so it makes sense that in this temptation in the desert, that Satan offers Jesus 3 shortcuts away from the cross to be able to win the world. But I ask you, is that even what our Lord came to do? Our Lord didn't come to win the world. He came to save the world. And who did he come to save the world from? Ourselves. He came to save us from ourselves. And if sin came into the world by a tree, well, guess what? It is going to be conquered by a tree. It's going to be conquered by the cross. And therefore, the cross is a necessity. The cross is the means of our salvation. Each and every single one of us have some sort of cross in our life. And I promise you that you're going to have a desire to run from it. But there seems to be this divine irony that the more you run away from your cross, guess what? The heavier it gets. Because if you embrace your cross, you may just so happen to find a Simon of Cyrene that's willing to help you carry it. But you cannot remove the cross from Christ. But in our Western civilization and our modern Western culture, we love being comfortable. And we will take any shortcut away from the cross that we can. Do you know what Christ is without his cross? What Christianity is without the cross? Do you know what it is? It's sentimentalism. It's effeminacy. It's not talking about sin. It's not talking about death. It's not talking about the reality of what real love entails. It's emotionalism. It's there to make us feel good. But I promise you that the cross will always find Christ. The more that you run from it, the more that the cross will find you, and the heavier it will become. You have to find your cross in this world. And the honest truth is that some of us have some pretty heavy burdens to carry. Don't ignore it. Don't take a shortcut away from it. You will only cause more destruction to your life. The cross is the means of our salvation. And the more you embrace it, the greater you'll be able to experience the glory that our Lord has to give to us. Because praise be to God that in 36 days when we celebrate Good Friday, that's not the end of the story. There's something that happens 3 days later. There's a resurrection. There is a restoration. And that is where the cross finds its value. The cross is the ultimate sign of love. Find your cross. It is the means to your salvation.